don't have the Psalms. That's
I'd like to support the ministry here.
all right. If everybody just take a copy here of Romans.
Morning.
Okay. We're now going to be studying Romans, and we'll start this off. Glory be to the Father. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Okay, this is a letter from Paul to the Romans. Actually, it was probably written before he got to Rome. He had tried several times, and of course he was actually sent to Rome over a legal case in which he was being tried in Rome for something that had been done earlier. However, he got to Rome. If you turn to page 13, and where it says themes and characteristics. Can somebody get a booklet to Cheryl over there? The booklets are right here. And anybody else not have a booklet? Okay. And this is going to explain why we are studying Romans, because of all the texts in the New Testament, I think this is the one that's going to teach you a lot. Okay, I'm going to be reading here, themes and characteristics. Romans is a work of profound theological reflection. As such, it has probably influenced Christian thinking and history more than any other epistle of Paul. It is his longest letter and, in the eyes of many, his most mature. Indeed, Paul has been preaching and defending the gospel, and now, at that point in time, it's the good news. I mean, the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John had not been written at this point. So we're just talking about the good news of Jesus Christ and his resurrection. So, for 2 decades before he wrote Romans, leaving us a work that is stamped with the imprint of his wisdom, depth, and spiritual energy. Even more than his other writings, however, Romans is full of things that are, quote, hard to understand, end quote. That's from 2 Peter. In other words, Peter didn't quite understand a lot of what Paul had to write. His style is more formal than usual, and his thoughts weave back and forth through a maze of theological mysteries concerning sin, judgment, righteousness, justification, sanctification, salvation, suffering, law, grace, sonship, election, mercy, sacrifice, and the triune God. If any New Testament epistle can claim to resemble a theological treatise, it is Romans. So that's why we are studying Romans. I think you're going to get more out of Romans. It's difficult to understand. I mean, there's a lot of people that have just thrown up their hands and said this is just incomprehensible. But we're going to go through it very slowly. It's going to take us probably about 3 or 4 months to get through it, probably at a snail's pace, but we'll get through it. And so as we turn to, let's see. Yes? It was probably written in the year 58. Most of your Gospels are not going to be written until about 80 or so. John was probably written the last one at right around the year 100. So the books of Paul and many of these other epistles were actually written all prior to the main, what we call Gospels of the New Testament. So about year 58, that's when they usually say that this particular epistle was written. And so the first, shall we say, books or works in the New Testament were actually the epistles. Okay, so it's going to start out the letter of St. Paul to the Romans, salutations, Paul. All right, now we're going to stop right there because in Latin, that's actually Paul. It's most of the time, most authors will say, well, he just went from Saul, which now the words in Hebrew is Shaul. It means asked for, prayed for. That was what Saul, although it's kind of pronounced Shaul in Hebrew. He went from that name, and most people say, well, he just selected a Gentile name because he's going to be the apostle to the Gentiles. Paul was much more deep than that. The Latin word is actually Paulus, and that's kind of what he was using. The word Paulus, Paulus. In Latin, that means small or little. And you were, well, why would he choose a paltry word like that? Because he felt that he was the least of the apostles. Paulus signifies that this is a man of humility. And remember what he had done before his conversion. I mean, he was out to kill Christians. He wanted them arrested, imprisoned, and done away with. But then he changed. He had a conversion. And I think because of his previous activities, there was a great amount of humility with Paul. It at times is not going to come through, but to a casual reader. But I think if you look at it closely, he's asking many people, always will note that he's always maybe complaining about a pain in his side, some kind of an impairment with him. And I think it's something eating away on his soul that he's sorry for. Now he has said, a servant of Jesus Christ. Now the word servant, as Professor Hahn will point out, is you can call it a slave, but a lot of translations will refer to more of a bond servant. In other words, this is a person that has done his time, but has chosen to continue with that particular master, and the master has continued to serve, to have that person as a servant, many times for life. So he is going to become a servant of Jesus Christ for life. And it's a willing servant. It's not a slave, but a servant. He's going to serve Jesus Christ. Called to be an apostle, that's called by Jesus Christ, set apart for the gospel of God. Again, remember that's just the good news, which he promised beforehand through his prophets in Holy Scriptures. The gospel concerning his son who was descended from David. Now, In the actual Gospels, there's a genealogy that will trace both Mary and Joseph all the way through, and they go both through David. So in other words, Jesus is in the line of David, or David, as it would be pronounced in Hebrew. And there's a prophecy that someone in the line of David would be the Messiah. In other words, this is a person that is not going to die, but have life everlasting. When Jesus rose, he's the Messiah. That is the proof that he was not going to die. He rose and then ascended to God, where he sits at the right hand of the Father. And of course, we have then the Holy Spirit then that kind of will take over in the hearts of, in other words, circumcising the hearts of true believers in Jesus Christ. Through, most thing is important is obviously baptism. But we will get into what he calls justification. But it should be pointed out that when Pontius Pilate put that I-N-R-I, remember, in Latin you don't have J's, so it's Jesus of Nazareth, Rex, or King of the Jews. I think Pilate knew, probably through his wife, but he knew that Jesus was in the line of David. And therefore, he was, and his father Joseph were actually, let's say, the true king of the Jews. Because you got to remember that Herod was an Edomite. That's from Esau, from the area of Jordan, present-day Jordan. And basically, he bought his way into becoming, it's easy to bribe a Roman and attain office. And you also know that if anybody stepped forward and said, no, I'm the true king, they would die. The original Herod, of course, kids that were under 2 years of age, put them to death. The later Herod, when the daughter wanted the head of John the Baptist, all right, that's fine, cut off his head. Very brutal people. And so you don't get out of line. And this is, of course, also why Joseph, received that inspiration in a prayer to leave the Holy Land and go into Egypt and then come back later again to save Jesus and Mary, because he didn't come until the original Herod had died. So this is, I think, why you have those genealogies in the Gospels, is to show you that Jesus is in line, and his father Joseph as well, probably the real true king of the Jews. But his kingdom, of course, Jesus' kingdom, is now just not of this world, but of the believers, of you and I. And we'll get into, explaining a little bit more about that. Okay, so we had the Son of God in power according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead. See, that was the proof that he is the Messiah. He rose from the dead. Through whom we have received grace and apostleship to bring about the obedience of faith for the sake of his name among all nations, including yourselves who are called to belong to Jesus. Okay, now we have three groups of people. There's going to be Jews, Gentiles, and Christians. Christians, of course, could be former Jews or former Gentiles. And we're going to get into this discussion about justification. With the Jews, as far as deciding, all right, what is right and what is wrong, what path you should take and what path you should avoid, they have the law of Moses. And that needed to obviously be, they were fleshly circumcised and they were trained. Next up you have the Gentiles, the ones that hadn't converted either way. But their justification is known as the natural law. That's the conscience in one's heart. And that also needs to be trained as well. But that is their justification there, that inner little voice, as Cardinal Newman would point out, telling you, you know, what is right and what is wrong, what you should do and what you shan't. And then thirdly, of course, you have the Christians who, as Paul will point out, has had your heart circumcised. That phrase also goes all the way back to Isaiah as well. It's about having no longer being a fleshy circumcision, but a circumcision of the heart. In other words, a grace from God, or we're going to call this the justification of grace, that you will receive in baptism and also the training too, but it requires the belief in Jesus Christ. So we got three different groups and three different kind of justifications for knowing what is right and what is wrong. And it's very important because, as André Gide, the French author, pointed out, it's good that you know that you have freedom in life, but it's even more important that you know what to do with your freedom. In other words, how to act upon your freedom. Because there's kind of a belief in a lot of people think that, well, freedom means I can move my arm as any way I want to, as long as it doesn't hit you and another person hit him in the nose. That's not what the Christian belief about freedom is all about. It's the ability to do what you ought to do. In other words, to do the right thing. Because this is what you're going to be judged on when you go to heaven. Your deeds, your acts. Yes, there's that, you need to have a contrite heart. But that's only half the battle. Just, believing Christ is that's one thing, but knowing how to act in a good way and in a right way is probably even more important. Because that's what you're going to be judged on by Christ, but also other people, because a lot of times your testimony in life is how other people perceive you. And for example, one of the great catastrophes that we've had in the Catholic Church is, regrettably, a lot of priests that have committed heinous acts with young boys especially. And that's turned off a lot of people from the Catholic Church. In fact, I believe with my wife, she comes from Northern California, and it bankrupted that diocese. And a lot of people left. And there's a lot of people, even to this day, that will use that as a slur against Catholics, even though it's just just not very many, but it's been enough, and it's a catastrophic problem. We've even had an archbishop on the East Coast that fell prey to the problems of same-sex attractions and other. And this is why Paul will get into this. I mean, even 2,000 years ago, it was a problem. And this is why your best avenue as far as spreading the word is how you act, what you do. People judge that all the time. And in one slight fall, and believe me, you'll get all sorts of bad gossip coming your way. To all God's beloved in Rome who are called to be saints. So once you become a Christian, you're meant to become a saint. You keep on, if you've got this grace in your heart and you do good deeds, you're going to become a saint. So grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Okay, next up is prayer of thanksgiving. First, I thank my God through Jesus Christ for all of you, because your faith is proclaimed in the world. For God is my witness, whom I serve with my spirit in the gospel of his Son, without ceasing. I mention you always in my prayers. So this is one of the acts that every priest is supposed to perform, and I'm sure Father Maurer does it as well. As one of his jobs is to be praying for all of us. And that's what it means in not only during the day, during the Mass, but such a spirit in his heart that it never ends. He's always praying for us. So again, that business about that without ceasing I mention you always in my prayers, asking that somehow by God's will I may now at last succeed in coming to you. So Paul has been, I think this is like about a 2-year ongoing project of him trying to get to Rome, because Rome is the seat of Western civilization at the time. It is the city. And if you can convert Rome, you're going to convert the whole empire. And that's eventually will happen, although the empire does get split because Constantine then moves on over to the area of Turkey there, and you kind of split between the Latin church in the west and the Greek church in the east, and then eventually there's going to be a schism around the year 1000, split between the two, between the Catholic Church in the west and the Orthodox in the east. For I longed to see you, that I may impart to you some spiritual gift, to strengthen you, that is, that we may be mutually encouraged by each other's faith, both yours and mine. So faith works both ways, and this is why back in Proverbs it was important on who you make friends with and who you associate with. It's also one of the reasons why you come here to St. Mark, because you are going to be associating with like-minded people that are going to, again, help you in your journey in holiness. And it is a journey. It just not happens boom, all at once. Even Paul, after his fall off of the horse, and then, or some animal, or maybe he just fell down. But then Ananias, about 3 days later or so, helped him bring his eyesight back, and where he could finally, took him quite a while to really understand what God or Jesus has been doing with his life. Especially when Jesus, although no longer alive, walking around on this earth at that point, said to Paul, why do you persecute me? So when you persecute Jesus, you're also persecuting the church. And if you're persecuting the church, you're persecuting Jesus. To give a while to fully understand what was going on. I want you to know, brethren, that I have often intended to come to you, but thus far have been prevented, in order that I may reap some harvest among you, as well as among the rest of the Gentiles. I am under obligation both to Greeks and to barbarians, both to the wise and to the foolish, so that I am eager to preach the gospel to you also who are in Rome. That business about that's an old phrase about the Greeks and the barbarians. So that's kind of a carryover from classical. Basically, barbarians aren't able to speak Greek. So that's one way to look at it. You know, kind of that word barbarians, bar. You know, that's they're kind of almost barking like a dog. But they're all in both groups. Like I say, they are what is referred to as Gentiles. In other words, they're people that are outside of the Holy Land. Okay, and now the power of the gospel. For I am not ashamed of the gospel. You know, at one time he was persecuting people that were, again, this gospel is the good news of Jesus Christ. It's not written down here yet. What's written down are just his epistles. It is the power of God for salvation to everyone who has faith, to the Jew first and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed through faith for faith, as it is written, he who through faith is righteous shall live. In other words, not on this earth, but it will continue into heaven. So again, the Jews, they've got the law of Moses, and that's good enough. For the Gentiles, the natural law that tells them what is right or wrong. And then with us, the Christians, we have grace, the law of grace, that Jesus, through baptism, has circumcised our heart, no longer needing the fleshly circumcision. So, in other words, baptism replaces the circumcision of the Jews. God's wrath against man's wickedness next. Well, I'm going to drop down here on the footnote on 116, I am not ashamed. Oh, before I go into this, in a lot of the footnotes and in my reading here that I will get to, this is also by Dr. Scott Hahn, he will use the word, we call it Lord. In the Bible, that big L and then capital O-R-D. That is a replacement for what they call the tetragram. Okay, there's 4 letters in Hebrew. There's like a Y, an H, a W, and an H. And of course, since Hebrew runs the opposite way, it goes from right to left. And that is God's name. And Dr. Hahn will put that in there, the typical way of writing it out. And I wish he hadn't. I believe that is an insult to the Jewish people. In the Jewish culture, they will use the word Adonai. They'll actually write sometimes that above this tetragram, or the name of God. They will not pronounce it itself. Just remember that in Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name, or made most holy, so holy that the Jews would not pronounce it. Okay, another very personal reason is I was a very young boy once upon a time. I know it's hard to believe, and I was a newspaper carrier. And one day, it was a very, very bright summer day, and I was walking up the sidewalk to deliver a newspaper, and Mrs. Varon was out there gardening. And on her right arm was this tattooing of, it looked like old German, letters and numbers. She was in a concentration camp when she was much younger. And she told me about that she was strong enough and young enough to live. The rest of the family died. And then somehow she got to this country and was married and raised two young boys, both of them who were roughly about the same age as I was at that time. And I can still remember that in my mind's eye. I mean, it's something that's never gone away, of her story. Later on, that same story would actually be in the newspapers. She told her story to a newspaper carrier, or a newspaper reporter. And so I have a great respect for the Jewish people and what they've gone through. My own relatives had a difficult time getting out of Europe too, but not quite that bad. So I will try to avoid, if I ever do say that tetragram, as Dr. Kahn will write it here, it's only by a mistake. I will try to change it to Adonai every time I come across it. And I believe that's actually current Catholic teaching too, that we should not be saying that word. Okay, so God's wrath against man's wickedness. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and wickedness of men, who by their wickedness suppress the truth. This is what God stands for. It's the absolute truth. It's not something relative that, that's only your opinion, or I have this truth and it's mine, and you might have something else. No, it's the absolute truth. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. Ever since the creation of the world, his invisible nature, namely his eternal power and deity, has been clearly perceived in the things that have been made. So they were without excuse, for they knew God. They did not honor him as God or give thanks to him, but they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless minds were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man or birds or animals. Now, I'm going to stop right there for a minute. Many cultures have, I think, in fact, most people worldwide, human nature, somehow believe that there is a God, that this world did not come merely by chance. Even the great scientist Albert Einstein pointed out that God does not play craps, that game with a dice where you throw it over and over again. God does not play craps with the universe. In other words, things just didn't happen by chance, because Einstein went, all right, and who created gravity? The laws of thermodynamics, where did they come from, and why? And all these other laws of physics, whether it's Boyle's law, Bohr's law, all these other laws that we have that daily are a fact of life, where did they come from? Who created them? It's just not by chance. It's like in this building, for example. Well, right now we're in a building. It's actually fairly warm for a change in here. But where did the warmth come from? Well, obviously we know that there was a plan drawn, blueprints in the old days. And then there was a contractor, and then there was all sorts of workmen that, masons that put in the bricks and everything, and the glass. I know they've had to do the roof a couple of times because it leaks on occasion in the past. And so everything around us, this table in front of me, the chair, it was built by somebody. We know that. We didn't see them. It just didn't magically appear by chance. It was created by someone. And this is kind of what Paul is pointing out, that there's a creator behind everything. I know as a young child, when for some reason I've always been interested in science, and kind of it's what I do now. But plants with its photosynthesis, the fact that I've got a carbon nature, in fact all humans do, I've got a respiratory system, a circulatory system, so I'm able to breathe, and then, it's amazing how the circulatory system then will take food and everything else and move it around and keep me alive. And so we're a very fragile creation, and in fact most of us, I think, is actually water, but it's wonderful how we're put together. And the great French mathematician Duhem pointed out that, well, you take all these things, the right temperature, the right amount of oxygen, the right amount of sunlight and light and so forth, and on it goes. All these things that make up life, you take the probability of these things happening, and it's impossible. It points up to the probability of all this happening is 0. It's just not going to happen, but it does. And that's what Paul is pointing out, that if you really don't understand the complexity of life and everything that takes us to be living here right now, for us to see each other, in my case with just one eye, and to express thoughts and ideas and speech, and how that somehow reaches you, and hopefully it'll help you evangelize other people. All these things, it's just mathematically impossible that it can ever happen by chance. And this is why he's saying that, if you're just one day just sitting out there thinking about the birds and the bees, you're on the right track. That life is extremely complex. And a lot of people that are atheists or agnostics or something like that are basically fools. I remember it wasn't too long ago, I had a person that came to me, and not on the job, but elsewhere, and he was going on and telling me how he was believed in wokeness, and he was a democratic socialist, and on and on, and then he ended it all by telling me that he was an intellectual, and I said, oh, thank you very much, because I never would have guessed it. At that point, he got up and left, but so much for self promotion, but claiming to be wise, and there's a lot of things I don't know, believe me. That's why I have a lot of these things by Scott Hahn. He's far more intelligent than I will ever be. He's got a PhD in sacred scripture and theology, and I don't. So, claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for just these little images that that it's just a block of wood or a block of marble or something else. There's nothing divine about that. And you really got to be dumb to worship that. And these days, unfortunately, a lot of these, without God, without right direction, people fall into abnormal sex or drugs or a lot of things that are really damaging to them. They're searching for something in all the wrong places. Wasn't that a song or something like that, Matt? Trying to find love or something like that in all the wrong places. Yeah, something like that. Well, and it's true. Anyway, it's true. A lot of people that don't come to this church, I wish they would, but they're off. They might call themselves a seeker of truth. Well, there is the truth, and it's right here. Okay, verse 24. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity. See, here we go. A lot of the nonsense that goes on in our present culture, where people can't even they don't even know, they cannot define what a woman is. Or they believe that men can have children. I mean, how stupid can you get? But that's the way things are these days. And it's not as, Paul was dealing with these same idiots back, 2,000 years ago. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth about God for a lie and worshiped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. A lot of these pagan rites were also involved. Temple prostitution and a lot of other depravity. And or have 1:18 to 32 right there in the footnote below. Paul reflects on the moral and spiritual depravity of the Gentiles. Although God placed himself and his law within the reach of their rational minds, they defiantly turned their backs to him, piling ingratitude upon impiety. Upon their sins smothered his truth within their consciousness. This is the underlying cause of their foolish and idolatrous ways. Paul's diagnosis of pagan corruption has close affinities with the Jewish assessment. In other words, this is why the Jews were not ever to mingle too much with the pagans, lest they also be dragged down. Okay, now before I get, we'll keep it going until we get to the end of chapter 1, and then I'm going to go back through some of the insights of Dr. Hahn, and because he's going to go in more in depth on natural law and things like that. Okay, we're on verse 26. For this reason, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Their woman exchanged natural relations for unnatural. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with woman and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in their own persons the due penalty for their error. And again, I refer to the problems of the Catholic Church itself with sexual predation of young men by older men, and people are scandalized by that, as it should be. And this is why these days they do a much better job of screening who is going to become in holy orders and who is just going to be, you're not going to go into the priesthood. And it's very narrow. I know there's been a few cases that I'm familiar with where somebody has been charged with something. The police really find, no, this doesn't really rate or come to the level of something that's criminal. I'm talking about a priest that used to be here at St. Mark, and he's been removed as an active priest and told to basically for the rest of his life, go over and contemplate, what he had done. It was something that I know I talked to Father Mulholland about. He couldn't give me the details, obviously. It was confidential. But I liked that priest. I thought he was a great man. I thought he was a good priest. But he had stepped over the line under the new procedures and guidelines of what a Catholic Church is all about and what a priest can and can't do. He had just gone over the line just a little bit, but he had gone over the line. So it's much more preventive these days, I think, than it had been in the past. I think a lot of people like myself many years ago, maybe you're sitting down and, well, I'm not going to go into all the details, but there was a problem, and it was just going to bubble up in the future and get worse, and it did, unfortunately. And since they did not fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a base mind and to improper conduct. They were filled with all manner of wickedness, evil, covetousness, malice, full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, malignity. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless, though they know God's decree that those who do such things deserve to die. They not only do them, but approve those who practice them. And unfortunately, a lot of the stuff is going on today where you have this relativism. I know that was one of the big points that Cardinal Ratzinger was making, later on, Pope Benedict XVI, about relativism, where people were, instead of the absolute truth and absolute doctrine and absolute way of living, everything became relative. That, oh, I can believe whatever I want to believe, and you can believe whatever you want to believe. And then they just, being completely non-judgmental, they allow a lot of things to occur. And it comes back, though, with bad results and lawsuits and basically crippling a lot of dioceses and where they can't really carry out their commandment to evangelize the world as well as they should. So there you go again. Okay, now, so that's the end of chapter 1 there. Now I'm going to move back to footnote here on page 18, 1:17, righteousness of God, a towering theme of the book of Romans. It has two related meanings. One, it denotes the covenant faithfulness of Adonai. See, I'm not going to say that word. Revealed through the notes, probably through the history and scriptures of Israel. God shows himself righteous when he keeps his promises and fulfills his covenant commitment to bless the righteous and rain curses upon the wicked. 2, it also denotes an inward grace that establishes the faithful in a right covenant relationship with God. These two meanings work together in Romans. And then it has the C word justified here, justified through faith for faith. From start to finish, the Christian life advances by faith. The expression that Paul uses here suggests he envisions a steady increase in faith. In the same prepositions are used in the same sequence in the Greek version. He who through faith, a citation from Habakkuk 2:4. Habakkuk receives a word of hope in the midst of a message of judgment. Although Adonai was sending Babylonian hordes to punish Israel for its sins, he promised to spare the just man who keeps faith. Received in faith, Paul's gospel offers the same hope of deliverance in the face of the coming judgment. In other words, we're all going to be judged by your actions, by your faith. The most important thing is to have faith in Jesus Christ and act accordingly. Now, continue here from 1:18 to 3:20. Paul paves the way for good news with the bad news of human sin. He declares all nations guilty before God. The Gentiles for rejecting the natural revelation of God in the world. In other words, that natural law. And Israel for spurning the supernatural revelation of God in the Scriptures. In other words, he's going to talk about hypocrisy there. And now I'm going to, in the last couple of minutes, I think you're getting probably a good education here with Romans, and then it's going to get followed up, of course, by a video. We're going to continue that on St. Augustine. There are other great theologians, St. Thomas Aquinas, of course. But believe me, I don't know how you do. St. Thomas Aquinas is very, very difficult. I mean, you really got to be, he's a great, great thinker. But I think it's easier to understand St. Augustine for the average person. So you're going to get Romans here and Augustine, and that's one of the best educations I think you're going to get on exactly what the gospel, the theology of the gospel is really all about. So as I'm going to continue here a little bit about the righteousness of God. Now this is again from Dr. Scott Hahn. This is called Romans. And he has a whole collection of books here. Before all else, Paul contends that the gospel reveals the righteousness of God. By this, he means that God has shown himself faithful to his covenant commitments of old by accomplishing his greatest saving work in Jesus Christ. So there, obviously, what the Bible is all about is a slow development in Revelation. Paul elucidates this theme throughout Romans by an eye toward two developments in the early church that demanded careful explanation. A, Christ's acceptance of Gentiles into the Messianic community without requiring their submission to Jewish rites such as circumcision. And B, widespread unbelief in the gospel among Jews who could seem to call into question the veracity of the church's proclamation. Because these missionary questions of the veracity of the church's proclamation, because these missionary situations raise questions about God's plan for Israel and the world, Paul labors in Romans to vindicate the faithfulness of God by delineating the various ways the Lord is accomplishing salvation for all people. He is not content simply to assert God's fidelity, love, kindness, truthfulness without support. He shows how God's action in Christ confirms the divine promises to the patriarchs, and of course the old saints in the Old Testament, the testimony of the Mosaic law, and the expectations of the prophetic writings. In particular, Paul expounds God's righteousness with reference to God's covenants with Abraham and David. He contends with the Abrahamic covenant, which included promises of Abraham's universal fatherhood. In other words, for the whole world, not just the Jews themselves, and worldwide blessings through his elect offspring. Reaches fulfillment as Jews and Gentiles come into faith in Jesus Christ and to receive his salvation on equal terms. For believing Jews, the true significance of circumcision as a sign of the Abrahamic covenant is fulfilled when they exercise the faith of Abraham and observe the Torah from the heart. That only a remnant of Israel has come to embrace the gospel is no argument that the word of God has failed, since Scripture reveals that the Israel of faith has always been a chosen subset of Israel according to the flesh. Likewise, in reference to believing Gentiles, Paul insists that their faith is counted as righteousness, just as Abraham's was before he was circumcised, and that their imitation of Abraham's trustful reliance on God makes them his spiritual children, fulfilling the divine pledge that Abraham would become the father of many nations. All this was made possible, Paul says, because the Father did not spare his only Son, but handed him over to death, just as Father Abraham willingly surrendered his beloved Isaac, so that the blessings of the covenant would flow out to all the nations. Less appreciated, but no less important, is Paul's announcement that God has also fulfilled his covenant of kingship with David. This was the Lord's threefold pledge to dethrone David's offspring forever, to make his heir a, quote, son by royal adoption, and to establish the heir's rule over Israel and Gentiles together. So again, we have this kingship of David, or David in Hebrew, and it's going to be Jesus. It was precisely this complex of promises that defined most of the messianic expectations in the first century, and Paul makes them a vital part of his gospel exposition in Romans. Now you got to remember, by the time of Jesus, I mean, you had on the throne, the quote-unquote king of the Jews, was Herod, who was not in the line of David at all. And everybody knew that. So the one who was, and this is why you have that genealogy from both Mary and Joseph going through David. So Jesus and Joseph and Mary are in the line of David, and so they will become in that spiritual line leading from David. Less appreciated, but no less important, is Paul's announcement that God has also fulfilled his covenant of kingship with David. This was the Lord's threefold pledge to enthrone David's offspring forever, and Jesus will live forever, to make his heir a son by royal adoption, and to establish the heir's rule over Israel and the Gentiles together. It was precisely this complex of promises that defined most of the messianic expectations in the first century, and Paul makes them a vital part of his gospel and exposition in Romans. From the start, he gives Jesus the title Christ, a reference to the Anointed One, or Messiah of ancient Jewish theology. Lest this goes unnoticed, Paul affirms that Jesus was born of the royal line of David, according to the flesh, and that God raised him to an immortal life in kingship as Son of God in power. Not only does this verify God's faithfulness to Israel, who received the strongest assurances that the Lord's covenant with David would not falter, but the Davidic kingship of Jesus has direct implications for the nations beyond Israel as well. Quote, "The root of Jesse shall come, raised up to rule the Gentiles." End quote. That's Romans 15:12. Paul reminds his readers, citing Isaiah 11:10. In Paul's vision, the risen Jesus is enthroned as Messiah and Lord, quote, "at the right hand of God, where he intercedes for Israel and the nations and summons all to submit to his lordship with, quote, the obedience of faith." Now that word obedience is very important because, all right, what is the opposite of obedience? It is sin. It's not disobedience, it's sin. So you're either going to be obedient to the faith or you're going to fall into sin. You know, there's nothing really in between. You either do what is right or you don't. You know, it's like a lot of people, can you count on them or not? And at that point, I'm going to stop, and Kirk will put on, I think it's the second disc. Yeah, first one. Let's see, do we have that set up? Okay. And then next week we will continue on the reconciliation of the world and requirements of the Christian life. And then we'll get into some of all about the Gentiles and natural law and many other things from. No, we're still slugging away on chapter 1. It just is that I'm going over chapter 1 from Dr. Scott Hahn's book. And so you can read chapter 2, but we probably won't get to it until the third week. So each of these chapters is going to take a couple of weeks to get through. That's why March, April, May, and probably into June, it's going to be about 4 months before we get through all this, because it's going to take about 30 weeks. There's 15 chapters and about 2 weeks on each chapter. So I think that's going to, and then after that, then we're going to get into the Psalms. And then that's all going to go all the way through the Psalms. There's 150 Psalms. That's going to take a long while. And then after that, we'll get into Job and some of the other, getting back to wisdom literatures of Job and Sirach and others. Yes? If you want, we can do that.
As a group?
Yes, we can do that. All right. Okay, do those. We will, page 43. So we'll go over at least we'll go over next week, those study questions.
These lectures are titled St. Augustine's Confessions, Part 1.
Earlier on, Bill characterized the first two books of the Confessions as the miseducation of Augustine, and we've seen that miseducation in terms of his early schooling. Book 2 continues the miseducation, but with two very interesting and significant changes. Change number 1 is we move from childhood to adolescence, and with it a kind of awareness of Augustine's sexuality, which is going to become, of course, one of the key themes throughout the Confessions. And number 2, instead of formal schooling, the miseducation continues and at the hands of his parents, so that his parents, his father Patricius and his mother Monica, become players in the book for the first time in Book 2.
The early pages of Book 2 have some interesting language that Augustine uses. We should not be surprised that he goes about a half a dozen words before he talks about the foul deeds he committed. Given what we saw, especially at the end of Book 1, that shouldn't surprise us. But a few lines further down, he talks about his disintegrated self. Very interesting term, especially when we go back all the way to the introduction to Book 1 of the Confessions, where he talks about our hearts being restless until they rest in God, talking about that sort of peace and harmony, if you will, to use Plato's language, of the parts of the soul. But he talks here about his disintegrated self. And then turning more specifically to his adolescence, he talks about murky clouds. I think anybody who's been through adolescence, which I guess is all of us, understand the murky clouds. And he says this about his adolescence. What was it that delighted me? Only loving and being loved. But there was no proper restraint, as in the union of mind with mind, where a bright boundary regulates friendship. Remember, we saw right at the end of Book 1, he talked some about friendship, just hanging out with his kid friends, his kid buddies. But here he says a couple things happen. One is that, if you will, hormones, adolescence is taking away an idea that should be developing in me, that friendship is a relationship between two minds, two souls, two people. Rather, everything was sort of physical. I was sort of carried away by all of that stuff. And therefore, in some of these very early phrases and passages, he's really trying to set up that memory we all have of the confusion, the temporary joys, and all the rest that go with becoming an adolescent.
Yeah, to put it another way, nothing really destroys the peace and harmony of the soul so well as puberty. And the world is really very different before and after. And there's a really wonderful sense of that in the opening pages. But it's interesting that, again, toward the beginning of this book, he says, well, there would have been a solution to this. Nobody really thought to arrange a marriage for me. That would be a way to get love and loving, to sort of put down lust and all of that. And nobody bothered to do that. That seems to us to be a kind of weird solution to the puberty question. I look out at my classes of undergraduates and I say, how many of you have been married at 15? And the answer is nobody. But in fact, arranged marriages at an early age were much more a part of their society than ours. So that's not a ridiculous suggestion, even though it's a suggestion that Augustine is ultimately going to reject later on. After he becomes a Christian, he decides that he is going to remain a celibate Christian rather than a married one. And this was a real decision on Augustine's part. And in some ways, bringing up the question of marriage this early is another one of those thematic clues about things that he's going to talk about later on. But he says, there it was, didn't happen, so let's go on to talk a little bit about the turmoil. And he does this by talking a lot about his relationship with his parents as well. How did they fit into this? And all of these things come together in interesting ways in Book 2 of the Confessions.
He especially takes up the story of his father right at the beginning of Book 2. His father will turn out to be a minor character, if you will. He would not get top billing when they make the movie out of this, because he's essentially a bit player in Book 2, and then he dies shortly after the story of Book 2, although Augustine doesn't mention his dad's death until quite a bit further on in the book. But one of the first things he says about his dad is, boy, did people praise my dad because my dad really put up the bucks for my education. He said, my dad and mom weren't nearly as prosperous as other kids in our town, other kids that I knew. But my dad really made economic sacrifices to send me to the best schools. And people praised him for that. I mean, we have similar kinds of things today. Look at this guy. He footed the bill for so-and-so go off to Williams or Amherst or whatever it might be, even though it means not, buying the second car or keeping the same suit for another year or not getting new aluminum siding. So that Augustine begins with the world's praise of his dad. But as Augustine, the writer, looks back at that praise, he says it really was praise that ultimately my dad didn't deserve very much.
And it's also interesting that in this same chapter, his mother comes up, and they're kind of given equal time. He's not quite as hard on his mother, but by the same token, he doesn't really praise her all that much, and he mentions that her point of view, her perspective, was one that was also very limited, that to a certain extent she kind of bought into this success story, the North African version of the American dream, if you will. The interesting thing is that, as Bill said, Patricius, the father, really does die out as an important character later on, but later on Monica becomes very important, that her relationship to Augustine is one of the most important of all of the relationships in the book, and the actual death of Monica, which took place in the presence of Augustine, turns out to be one of the true climaxes of the story. So here you have them kind of presented as equal partners. One disappears, one goes on to be extremely important. And again, just another clue to what we'll be looking for a little bit later on.
So why does Augustine, looking back, say that that praise of Dad was really quite shallow and really not deserved? Well, I think as Augustine looks back, he sort of asks the question, what was in Dad's mind when he was putting up the bucks for me to go away to school? Was he, in fact, concerned about the education because it would develop my character and make me a better person and lead me in the right direction? Or was it ultimately a kind of selfish deed? We all, I think, as parents, know the temptation to say, well, I'm going to send my kid to this school, and boy, are people going to praise me. Even more so, we need to remember that Augustine lives in a world without Medicare, without Social Security, and with a lot of the other things that we associate with the sort of prospect of getting old and comfortable and relaxed in our final years. And so, as Augustine looks back and says, I think Dad was doing this for Dad, for his reputation. And after all, if I become rich and famous, he becomes a little more famous and at least economically secure. And so, once again, on the surface, his father appears generous. When we get beneath the surface, his father is indeed selfish, and that leads us back to where we've been before. How can a parent or a school teacher teach a child to turn away from self and towards something higher if the teacher himself, in this case Patricius, the father of Augustine, has not made that turning himself? It raises that question and reminds us of the fact, how do you get an education when the people educating you aren't educated?
Yeah, again, to come back to something Bill said about the folks who will sacrifice anything to get their kids into a good school, that's sort of become a kind of American obsession. And it's interesting, college teachers as we are, we get to see some of this from a different perspective, perhaps. It's interesting to see how much self-interest seems to be there, and also the whole question that comes up now, do you choose the right kindergarten so that a person can get into a good college? It seems to me that Augustine would not be terribly surprised at the direction things have taken, looking at it and sort of observing things in terms of his own father. In any case, one of the most interesting stories of the entire Confessions, and perhaps the most interesting in this book, comes at a place where the two themes that we've kind of brought together here, the idea of Augustine's adolescent lusts and his relationship with his family, they kind of come together when his father gets to observe Augustine at the bathhouse. We need to remind ourselves, by the way, that there was, people who go to bathhouses today might be seen as a bit suspect or a bit off the mainstream. This was simply the way you got clean in Augustine's society, and everybody did it, from nuns in convents to the folks who were the leaders of society. So the fact that they're there shouldn't tell us anything one way or another, except that it was a chance for dad and son to hang out together. And Augustine has an incredibly interesting observation about what happened there.
For when at the baths one day, he, that is to say Augustine's dad, saw me with unquiet adolescence, my only covering, and noted my ripening sexuality, he began at once to look forward eagerly to grandchildren and gleefully announced his discovery to my mother.
Well, we get into some tricky business here. This is one of the passages that is a cause for many different interpretations. And in fact, one way to take a look at it is to look at a bunch of modern translations and to ask the magic question, what is it that his father was looking at when he was looking at Augustine? I think that it's deliberately meant to be vague, and having messed around with the Latin for a while and having studied the Latin, I'm not sure that I have any really appropriate theory about what it is, except to say that these were the signs of puberty. Cook and I had debates in the past that we won't go into, but I will just say that they were R-rated rather than X-rated. But in any case, what happens is that you now not only have, how do I want to say this, Augustine's sexuality is not only something that is inward toward him, but something that is now a public fact, and his father's response to it is, oh good, grandchildren, which again in itself doesn't seem to be such a bad deal, but the question that Augustine has is, what does that mean to his father, and what does that have to do with his own moral development? Because of course what his father conspicuously doesn't do is to sort of give him an education on sort of the moral obligations of sexuality.
I think that's the important point. Again, we are not surprised that he says, wow, I'm going to be a grandfather before too long. In all likelihood, does not seem to us to be a ridiculous or even unusual kind of response. But again, we need to think about this in probably the way Augustine is conceiving it. First of all, and I think everybody has experienced this and looks forward to that moment of grandchildren, it is a way of achieving a kind of immortality. You know, the family's going to continue for another generation. I see that coming down the pike now. I'm going to get to play with those little tykes who are born, who are my grandchildren. You know, all the things you say about being a grandpa. What I'm really looking forward to is I get to play with them and hand them to somebody else when they have dirty diapers. You know, all those kinds of things. But I think even more, in the Roman tradition, very often names skipped generations, so that it might very well be that Augustine would name his first son, Patricius, for example. And that's another kind of immortality, perhaps. And so, once again, I think that Augustine is suggesting to us that this revelation that his dad had in the baths, when, of course, everybody's naked, this revelation he had should have led to that, son, we need to have a talk situation. What it led to is, yippee, this is good for me. This is something that's going to give me pleasure and joy because I'm going to get to see, you know, whether it's little baby Patricius or little baby something else, that's going to be something that's in this for me. And it's another reflection, therefore, of what may seem to us like a natural reaction, which Augustine argues is a selfish reaction on the part of Patricius.
I want to piggyback on that for just a second. That sense of grandchildren as a kind of immortality, I think, is ultimately connected with the idea that after his conversion, Augustine decides to live a celibate and for a while monastic life. It's not as though what he's trying to do is reject what his father was after. He's not trying to say that children are a bad thing, but he is, among other things, making a particularly Christian statement, and that is that Christians don't necessarily depend on that kind of immortality, that there is something higher for them to seek, and therefore they do not need it in the way that Patricius in this way seems to. So that it's not so much a rejection of Patricius as it is an acceptance of something else. But again, the seed for that particular plant in the Confessions is sown here when we see what Augustine's decisions are after the moment of his conversion.
Certainly, Augustine is not necessarily saying, boy, I wish, that very day Dad and I had had a heart-to-heart talk. Most 14, 15, as in the case of Augustine-year-old boys, don't look forward to that talk particularly. It is, of course, as he looks back saying, boy, you always need moral guidance in your life, but wow, adolescence sort of gets, the bold print of needs moral guidance in the chart of life. And here is this place where I'm becoming a more public figure, I'm becoming physically stronger, I now have the power to make babies. I have all these adult things that I can now do physically, and I don't have any guidance as to how to use it. It was hard enough, as we know, and Augustine would sort of say he failed at it, it was hard enough being a good little kid. I stole and I cheated and all these sort of things. Now that I'm entering in that very much bigger stage of life, wow, did I need something. Boy, did I not get it.
Okay, so he doesn't get it from his father. Does he get it from his mother? Well, at best we can say sort of. What Monica says, again, Augustine's very clear. Let's look at see how Mom responded to his adolescence and to his progress in school. And it's kind of interesting to think about who really does the dirty work of that kind of stuff. I mean, we have this stereotype of the dad sitting down and giving the heart-to-heart. My guess is that in most families it's the mother who really does it in any case. And in this family, what is it that Monica says? Well, first thing she does is say, adultery, very, very bad thing. And it probably would be better if you could remain celibate, not do this sex thing at all. But it's very interesting the step that she goes from there. It seems as though she herself doesn't have any great hope that this is in fact what's going to happen. And she says, look, if you're going to have sex, don't get married, because that's going to take you away from your studies and damage your career. So in this, she seems to be, at this point in her life, as much implicated in the success thing, in the get-ahead thing, as her husband, as Patricius. And given the role that she plays later on, and given the kind of conversion that she has later on, this is sort of startling. It seems to me that there's at least a kind of ambiguity here. To be sure, one of the issues is that Monica sees the importance of education not simply in terms of getting ahead. Monica is very interested in seeing this education as a means to something higher, believes that Augustine can actually use this education to help dedicate himself to God and to learn to find God. But there is a sense in which she seems to be buying into the system as well, and a sense in which the parents are sort of equally guilty in this part of the miseducation of Augustine.
From this brief discussion, he'll come back to Monica and Patricius a little bit later, as will we. From this part of the discussion, however, he goes to saying, let me tell you once again about guys I hung out with. Let me tell you a little bit about what that was like. He talks about the fact that we guys would get together and we'd brag about all the disgusting things we'd done. We'd brag about our immoralities, and if we hadn't, in fact, done enough of them, we'd sort of make them up. Well, again, anybody who's been through adolescence and hung out with a bunch of folks knows that one pretty well. That probably doesn't need a lot of explication. But at any rate, we know that sense of, well, he talks about it at the beginning of Book 2, I'm in love with the idea of being in love, and we got to tell all these stories. I know when I was in college, different guys would come back to the dorm or to the fraternity house or whatever after a night out and tell stories, and I would have sort of a discount rate that I would apply. Probably 40% of this is true, 78% of this is true, none of this is true, and whatever. And Augustine was clearly sort of part of that culture that says, I've really got to tell them I did more things than I've actually done, because that's what it means to be one of the guys. Another aspect of why did he need moral guidance? Because when you hang out with the guys and this is the culture, you need something that counters that culture. And Augustine has no counter to what's going on.
Yeah. Again, you look at this, the modern tendency, and I think there's a degree to which it's right, is to say, what's the big deal? That's exactly what kids do. They brag about things that haven't really happened. They hang out together and they do all of that stuff. But Augustine is saying that this is precisely the sort of habit that's going to prevent anybody from looking at or looking for something higher. To find something higher, you've got to know it's there. Again, Plato's cave analogy seems to be at the back of so much of this. If you're chained to the wall, looking at the shadows of the wall, you have no idea that there is something more out there. And part of the problem for Augustine is, let's take a look at all of the different places where he could have gone to get this sense of something higher. School didn't do it very well. In fact, led him in the opposite direction. Friends didn't do it very well, led him in the opposite direction. Even parents led him in the wrong direction. And now here, he's again sort of cashing in on his adolescence, cashing in on the fact that he is now able to do manly things, mostly by shooting the bull with other folks. You get the impression that Augustine himself didn't do very much of this kind of stuff in actuality, but that's not the point. The point is that that was looked upon as a kind of, that was looked upon as what you were supposed to aspire to. And Augustine, from the point of view of the later converted bishops, said, if you don't have anything better to aspire to, then you're not going to aspire to anything better.
I want to pick up on a statement that Ron made. He talked about being chained in the cave as sort of where Augustine is right now. In fact, Augustine uses that language at the beginning of Book 2. He talks about the clanking chain of his mortal state. And that's very important, because not only is there the Platonic allusion there of being chained in the cave, there's also the Augustinian, the Pauline allusion from the letter to the Romans. That is to say that we are born enslaved to sin, and that we are therefore chained up by sin. And so in both ways, both in the image of Plato's cave and in the image that Paul has in the letter to the Romans about the human condition, that really is where Augustine is. And then he turns to another interesting and pregnant phrase. With companions, talking about his friends, like these, I roamed the streets of Babylon and wallowed in its filth as though basking amid cinnamon and precious ointments.
It's very interesting to hear the word Babylon there. That obviously would have had this tremendous resonance among Augustine's Christian readers. That was sort of the biblical city that signified everything that was wrong. And what's sort of interesting about it, in fact, is that Augustine uses it in such a way that he assumes his Christian readers are going to know it. It's a really cool example of the way in which Augustine interjects his later biblical knowledge, okay, the later biblical knowledge that he has into these narratives of earlier events. To make the obvious point, Augustine himself certainly would not have known that he was roaming the streets of Babylon at the time that he was doing all of this stuff. It's a very interesting conclusion that's brought to us retrospectively. But again, the thing that's kind of interesting is that if you sort of think about where Babylon occurs in the New Testament, that you have, for example, the Whore of Babylon as the symbol of all evil in the knockdown, drag-out fight at the end of all times that the book of Revelation describes. Again, our sense is, whoa, Augustine, aren't you exaggerating a little bit by bringing this particular biblical image to play here? I think his answer would be, again, take a look at where it goes. That the point is not the extreme evil of any one of these things, but the fact that it points you in a certain direction. And what Augustine is, I think, very big at throughout the Confessions is the idea that we become the kind of people that we are by the kind of habits that we acquire. And we acquire those habits by imitation. So what is it that he's imitating? Well, his teachers tell him something, his parents tell him something, his friends tell him something, and by imitating all of those, he's setting himself up to go in a direction that really is going to be the road to Babylon. So that what sounds like a kind of ridiculous exaggeration really is there to make an important point. And of course, what Augustine is saying is that you can go to Babylon or you can go to Jerusalem. Those are the only two choices ultimately. And the way that you are pointing early on is going to be pretty important in all of that.
I want to illustrate that with, again, a personal story. I adopted a 16-year-old, and it's easy to say, this 16-year-old is going to come and be part of my family, and everything's going to get great because all the bad things that have happened earlier in his life are going to be in the past. There's going to be security and love and all those things. And this part of Augustine really hit home for me after my son came to live with me, because much less changes than one would have hoped and one would have thought and one would have expected. Because already at age 16, there were certain patterns of conduct and habits that were very deeply ingrained. And I'm not talking about the fairly recent habits of smoking cigarettes or whatever, but there were really lifelong habits, things he'd been doing for 16 years until he came to live in my house. And there is no way to make them go away on a parent's part. There's no way to make them go away, it seems to me, even on the kid's part. It takes tremendous, to use Augustine's language, act of will. And I really saw that illustrated as I was so frustrated and disappointed, and at some points even angered by the fact that this story wasn't, at least in the short run, as happy an ending as I thought it would be. And to get to that happy ending was a much, much longer struggle than I expected.
Book 2 is a pretty complicated book because we talk about all of these things in terms of his education, in terms of his adolescence and what that means, in terms of friendship, all of these themes that are going to be picked up later on. And what Augustine does for us is present us with a kind of emblematic incident which not only brings all of those things together, but characterizes much of the struggle that he's going to have throughout the book. He talks in this book about a crazy thing that he and a bunch of his friends did one night just for kicks because they didn't have anything to do. And that event was sort of stealing a bunch of pears from a pear tree. Getting into that is something that is getting to the heart of the whole enterprise of the Confessions. So we're going to start now and spend a good deal of time on it as a story that really does summarize the narrative of Augustine's need for education, his failure to obtain it, and who he was, and by extension, who all of us are. Because in the pear tree incident, I think Augustine comes the closest, in terms of what we've seen so far, to generalize and to kind of turn himself into an everyman, where the story that he tells about himself is meant to reverberate into our own consciousness, and we're supposed to see ourselves there as well.
One way to look at this important story is to sort of remember where we are. Let's be, first of all, reminding ourselves of the language that Augustine uses as the context for this story. That is to say, he's in downtown Babylon. He says, you know, I'm not just sort of hanging around. I'm right at, you know, Main Street and Center Street of Babylon. That's where my life is right now. That's where my friends and I are hanging out. My mom, he says in a wonderful image, sort of in the suburbs of Babylon and moving away, but nevertheless, I mean, he does use that language. Nevertheless, she's still close. We know where Dad is. We know where Augustine's teachers are, so that when we come to looking at this incident in the next lecture in great detail, we need to be aware of this setting. And another part of that setting, it seems to me, is Ron's really quite well characterized the situation. We've looked at the situation in Augustine's schooling. We've looked at his parents. We've begun to look at his friendships. And in many ways, this next story is going to develop that third hunk of this triad. Again, who influences you in life? Teachers, parents, and friends. We've looked in detail at teachers. We've looked in detail at parents. And we've looked lightly and sparingly so far at friends. That's where it's going to shift as we turn to that story.
Yeah, and I think that this sort of preliminary outline of what we're going to do in the next lecture is particularly important because, again, one of these incidents where the criticism is, what's the big deal? Why spend so much time on an incident which, after all, at worst is a kind of petty crime and you know, something that really doesn't really demand the kind of exegesis that Augustine gives it. We're going to claim that it really does, and that'll be the substance of the next lecture.